Jake Morrison sat on the edge of his old wooden bed, staring at the foreclosure notice in his shaking hands. The paper felt heavier than it should, like it carried the weight of his entire life crashing down. Outside his small ranch house, the Texas wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls he couldn't afford to fix. $23. That's all he had left in the world. Not enough to save his ranch, not enough to buy feed for his remaining cattle, barely enough to buy a decent meal. His father had built this place with his bare hands 30 years ago, and now Jake was about to lose it all because he couldn't make the payments. The cattle market had gone to hell 6 months ago, and with it went Jake's dreams. He'd sold off most of his herd just to keep the bank happy, but it wasn't enough. Never enough. The banker, Mr. Peterson, had made it clear during their last meeting that Jake had until the end of the week. Pay up or get out. Jake pulled on his worn leather boots and grabbed his hat from the hook by the door. The mirror showed him a man who looked older than his 28 years. His face was weathered from too many days in the sun, his clothes patched and repatched, his eyes carrying the weight of failure. He needed to think, and thinking required whiskey. Murphy's Saloon was the only place in town where a man could drink his sorrows without judgment. The other patrons were usually too drunk to care about anyone else's problems. The October evening was cold, with that bite in the air that warned of winter coming soon. Jake's horse, an old Mari named Bessie, carried him slowly into town. Even she seemed to sense that things were different tonight, that this might be one of their last rides together. Murphy's Saloon buzzed with activity despite the early hour. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. Jake pushed through the swinging doors and made his way to the bar, where Murphy himself was polishing glasses with a rag that had seen better days. "The usual, Jake?" Murphy asked, not looking up from his work. "Make it a double," Jake replied. Sliding one of his precious dollars across the scarred wooden bar, the whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn. The kind that reminded a man he was still alive, even when everything else suggested otherwise. Jake was halfway through his second glass when the noise from the corner table caught his attention. Big Tom Harrigan was holding court at his usual table, a pile of money in front of him and 4 other men looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Harrigan was the kind of man who owned everything he looked at and wasn't shy about letting people know it. Cattle ranches, the general store, half the buildings in town, and rumors said he had the sheriff in his pocket too. "Come on, boys," Harrigan's voice boomed across the saloon. "Don't tell me you're all scared of a little 5-card stud. I've got money burning a hole in my pocket, and the night is young." Jake had played poker with Harrigan before, back when. He had money to lose. The man was good, but he was also cocky. Sometimes cocky players made mistakes, especially when they'd been drinking. Jake finished his whiskey and was about to order another when Harrigan's voice cut through the noise again. "Morrison! Jake Morrison! Come over here, son. I heard you're having some trouble with that little ranch of yours." Every head in the saloon turned to look at Jake. He felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he couldn't ignore the invitation. In a town like this, ignoring Big Tom Harrigan was like spitting in the devil's face. Jake walked over to the table, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The other players looked relieved to see him, probably hoping he'd take some of the heat off them. Sit down, Harrigan said, gesturing to an empty chair. "I was just telling these gentlemen about the poker game we had last spring." "You remember that night, don't you? When you walked away with nearly $50 of my money?" Jake remembered. It was the night before his father's funeral, and he'd been too drunk and too angry to care about the consequences. He'd played cards, like a man with nothing to lose, because at that moment he felt like he had nothing to lose. "I remember," Jake said carefully. "Good times," Harrigan laughed, but his eyes weren't smiling. "I've been thinking about that game ever since, wondering if it was skill or just beginner's luck." "Maybe we'll never know," Jake replied, starting to turn away. "Hold on now," Harrigan's voice had an edge to it. "Don't be so quick to leave. I heard the bank's been sniffing around your place. Shame when a man loses the family homestead." Jake's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting into a fight with Harrigan would only make things worse. That's my business, Jake said. Of course, Harrigan nodded. But I'm a businessman and I see opportunity everywhere. Tell you what, let's play one hand, winner takes all. I don't have anything worth betting, Jake said. Sure you do? Harrigan's smile was like a snake's. You've got that 20-something dollars in your pocket. I can smell desperation from. Here, Morrison, one hand. If you win, I'll give you enough money to save your ranch. If I win, well, you'll lose that pocket change a day or two before you lose everything else anyway. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably. They could sense the trap being set, but none of them were brave enough to speak up. Jake looked around the saloon, seeing the faces of men who had watched his family build something and were now watching him lose it all. How much? Jake asked. $500, Harrigan said casually, like he was talking about the weather. Jake's heart nearly stopped. $500 was more than enough to catch up on his payments and have money left over for winter. Feed, it was also more money than he'd ever seen in one place. What's the catch? Jake asked. No catch. Just one hand of 5-card draw. May the best man win. Jake knew it was stupid. Knew he was being set up. Knew that men like Harrigan didn't get rich by losing bets to desperate cowboys. But the foreclosure notice in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through his shirt. And $23 wasn't going to save anything. Deal the cards, Jake said, pulling out his remaining money and placing it on the table. The saloon grew quiet as Murphy dealt the cards. Jake picked up his hand with steady fingers, years of poker games teaching him never to show emotion. 3 sevens and 2 fours. A full house. It was the kind of hand that won big pots and changed lives. Harrigan looked at his cards with the same poker face he always wore, but Jake thought he saw something flicker in the older man's eyes. Doubt, maybe, or surprise. I'll bet it all, Jake said, pushing his $23 forward. Interesting, Harrigan mused. Very interesting, I call and I raise. He pushed a stack of bills toward the center of the table. 500 as promised. Jake felt sweat on his forehead despite the cool evening. This was it. Everything rode on these 5 cards. Call, he said. They laid down their hands at the same time. Jake's full house faced off against Harrigan's 2 pair. For a moment, the silence in the saloon was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Then the other players started talking at once. And Jake realized he had won. He had actually won. Well, I'll be damned, Harrigan said, but he didn't sound upset. If anything, he sounded amused. Looks like tonight's your lucky night, Morrison. But instead of pushing the money across the table, Harrigan leaned back in his chair with a strange smile. There's just one problem, he said. I don't have $500 on me tonight. Jake's stomach dropped. What? I said I'd bet 500 if you won, and you did win. Fair and square, but cash is a little tight this week. Harrigan's smile got wider. However, I do have something that might interest you. Something that's worth at least $500 to the right person. I don't want your land or your cattle, Jake said. I need cash. Not land, not cattle. Harrigan stood up and walked toward the back door of the saloon. Come on, let me show you what you just won. Against his better judgment, Jake followed Harrigan outside. The other players came too, curious to see how this would end. Behind Murphy's saloon was a small corral where Harrigan kept his personal horses when he was in town. In the moonlight, Jake could see a horse unlike any he'd ever laid eyes on. She was a paint horse with patches of brown and white that seemed to flow together like water. Even in the dim light, he could tell she was beautiful, with clean lines and a proud way of holding her head. Meet Devil's Dance, Harrigan said with obvious satisfaction. Prettiest horse in 3 counties and the most worthless. What do you mean? Jake asked. Can't be ridden? Can't be broken? I've had 6 different cowboys try to train her, and she's put 4 of them in the doctor's office. The other 2 quit before she could kill them. Mean as a snake and twice as dangerous. Jake moved closer to the fence, studying the horse. She stood perfectly still, but her eyes were alert, watching every movement. There was something in those eyes that didn't look mean. It looked sad. Why do you keep her if she's so dangerous? Jake asked. Because she's beautiful, and beautiful things have value, even if they're broken. Harrigan shrugged. Besides, I keep hoping someone will figure out how to fix her. Maybe you're that someone? Jake looked at the horse again. Even if she couldn't be ridden, she had to be worth something. A horse that beautiful would at least bring enough money to keep him going for a few more weeks. Deal, Jake said before he could change his mind. The first morning with Devil's Dance nearly ended in disaster. Jake had barely stepped into the makeshift corral he'd built behind his barn when the horse charged at him like a bolt of lightning. He dove sideways, landing hard in the dirt as hoofs thundered past his head, missing him by inches. His heart pounded as he picked himself up, brushing dust from his clothes. The horse stood on the far side of the pen, nostrils flaring, eyes wild with something that looked like pure fury. But as Jake studied her more closely, he realized it wasn't anger he was seeing, it was fear. "Easy, girl," he said softly, keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you." The horse snorted and pawed the ground, every muscle in her body tense and ready to strike. Jake had broken horses before, but never one that seemed so intelligent, so aware of everything happening around her. Most wild horses fought out of instinct, but this one seemed to be making calculated decisions about when and where to attack. For the next 3 weeks, Jake tried every trick he knew. He started with the gentle approach, sitting quietly in the pen and letting her get used to his presence. But every time he moved, even slightly, she would explode into violence, kicking at the fence posts and rearing up on her hind legs, like she was fighting an invisible enemy. Then he tried the traditional method, using ropes and pressure to force her into submission. That was a mistake he only made once. The horse seemed to anticipate his every move, dodging the lasso with an almost supernatural awareness. When he finally managed to get a rope around her neck, she fought so hard that she nearly strangled herself before he could get it off. Word spread quickly through the county about Jake's struggles with the paint horse. Men started showing up at his ranch just to watch the entertainment, placing bets on how long he would last before giving up or getting seriously hurt. "That horse is going to kill you, Morrison," said Pete Williams, a neighboring rancher who'd stopped by with 3 other men to watch Jake's latest attempt. "No horse is worth dying for." Jake wiped blood from a scratch on his arm where the horse's hoof had grazed him. "She's not trying to kill me," he said. "She's trying to protect something," the men laughed, but Jake was serious. He'd noticed things about Devil's Dance that others missed. The way she positioned herself in the pen, always keeping one eye on the distant hills. The way she would sometimes stand perfectly still, like she was listening for something only she could hear. And most importantly, the way she treated the beadwork in her mane and the small pouch around her neck. Anytime Jake got close to those decorations, the horse's behavior changed completely. Instead of general aggression, she became desperately protective, using her body to shield those items from his reach. It was like she was guarding treasure. The breakthrough came on a gray morning in late November. Jake had been trying to approach the horse for over an hour, moving slowly and speaking in calm tones, when she suddenly froze in place. Her head turned toward the east, ears pricked forward, staring at something Jake couldn't see, following her gaze. Jake spotted a figure on horseback sitting motionless on a ridge about half a mile away. Even at that distance, he could tell it was a native woman, her long black hair flowing in the morning breeze. She sat there for several minutes, just watching, then turned her horse and disappeared over the hill. When Jake looked back at Devil's Dance, something had changed. The wild fury in her eyes had been replaced by something else. Sadness, maybe, or longing. "Who was that girl?" Jake asked softly. "Someone you know?" For the first time since he'd brought her home, the horse didn't try to attack when he spoke. Instead, she walked to the fence closest to where the woman had been and stood there, perfectly still, like she was waiting for something that would never come. That afternoon, Jake made a decision that went against everything he'd been taught about horse training. Instead of trying to force Devil's Dance to submit, he simply sat down in the middle of the pen with his back against a fence post. The horse watched him suspiciously, probably expecting some kind of trick. But Jake just sat there, pulling out the old book of poetry his mother had left him. It was something he'd never done before, reading to a horse, but he was running out of ideas. "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep," he began, reading Robert Frost's words aloud. "But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep." Devil's Dance took a step closer, her ears rotating toward the sound of his voice. Jake continued, reading poem after poem, his voice steady and calm in the quiet afternoon air. Slowly, incredibly, the horse began to relax. By the third day of this routine, Devil's Dance was lying down while Jake read, her head resting on her front legs like a giant dog. She still wouldn't let him touch her, but she no longer tried to kill him every time he moved. It was during one of these reading sessions that Jake noticed the horse's strange behavior with the decorations in her mane. She would carefully move her head, positioning the beadwork so that the afternoon sunlight would catch it and create tiny rainbows on the ground. Then she would stare at those colors with an expression that looked almost human in its sadness. "Someone made those for you, didn't they?" Jake said softly. "Someone who cared about you a lot." The horse's ears flicked toward him, and for a moment their eyes met. In that instant, Jake felt like he was looking into the soul of a creature that was carrying a grief too heavy for any animal to bear. The next morning brought another visit from the mysterious woman on horseback. This time she was closer, maybe a quarter-mile away, and Jake could see more details. She was young, probably in her 20s, with traditional native dress and long braids decorated with feathers and beads. She watched for a long time before disappearing again, but this time Devil's Dance's reaction was different. Instead of just standing and staring, she began to move in a way Jake had never seen before. Her steps were precise and deliberate, almost like she was dancing. She would rear up on her hind legs, not in aggression but in a graceful movement that looked almost ceremonial, then come down and spin in a tight circle before rearing again. Jake watched in amazement as the horse performed what could only be called a dance, her movements flowing together in a pattern that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. When she finished, she walked to the fence and stood there, breathing heavily, looking toward the hills where the woman had been. "You're not broken at all, are you?" Jake whispered. "You're just missing someone." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he'd witnessed, about the careful way the horse moved, about the obvious intelligence behind her actions. This wasn't a wild Mustang that had never been trained. This was a horse that had been loved, cared for, and taught things that no cowboy in Texas would ever think to teach. The breakthrough came the next morning when Jake arrived at the pen to find Devil's Dance standing by the gate, calm and alert like she was waiting for him. When he opened the gate to enter, she didn't charge or retreat. Instead, she walked directly to him and stopped just out of reach. For the first time, Jake could see the intricate details of the beadwork in her mane. Each bead had been carefully chosen and placed, creating patterns that told a story he couldn't read but somehow understood. The leather pouch around her neck was decorated with symbols that looked like they had deep meaning, and the craftsmanship was incredible. "Someone spent months making these for you," Jake said, his voice full of wonder. "Someone who loved you very much." The horse's response shocked him. She lowered her head and took a step forward, close enough that Jake could have touched her if he'd wanted to. But he didn't move, sensing that this was a test of trust that could go either way. They stood there for what felt like hours, man and horse studying each other, both trying to understand something that neither of them had words for. Finally, Devil's Dance took another step forward and gently pressed her nose against Jake's chest, right over his heart. It was the gentlest touch imaginable, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. This horse wasn't broken or mean or dangerous. She was grieving, and she had been waiting for someone who understood the difference. "I don't know what happened to the person who made those decorations for you," Jake said softly, finally raising his hand to touch the horse's neck. "But I promise you this, I won't try to take them away from you, and I won't try to make you forget them." Devil's Dance stood perfectly still under his touch, her eyes closing as if she was finally allowing herself to rest. For the first time since Jake had won her in that poker game, the horse looked peaceful. The next morning brought the woman on horseback again, but this time she didn't stay on the distant ridge. She rode slowly down the hill toward Jake's ranch, and as she got closer, Jake could see that her face was marked by the same kind of grief he'd seen in Devil's Dance's eyes. When she reached the fence, she dismounted and stood there for a long moment, looking at the paint horse with an expression that mixed love, loss, and something that might have been hope. "Her name is not Devil's Dance," the woman said, her English accented but clear. "Her name is Dakota." "It means friend to all?" "In my language." Jake nodded, feeling like pieces of a puzzle were finally starting to fit together. "And who are you?" The woman standing by Jake's fence looked like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her dark eyes held a sadness so deep that Jake felt it in his own chest. And when she spoke about being the sister of the girl who loved Dakota, her voice cracked with barely contained emotion. "My name is Ayana," she said, her fingers gripping the fence rail so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "It means eternal blossom in our language. My sister was called Kimimela, which means butterfly." Jake noticed how Dakota responded to the sound of these names. The horse's ears perked up immediately, and she walked slowly toward the fence, stopping just close enough to smell Ayana's outstretched hand. For a moment, woman and horse simply breathed together, sharing something that Jake couldn't quite understand but felt deeply. "She remembers you?" Jake said softly. "Of course she does," Ayana replied, tears starting to form in her eyes. Kimimela and Dakota were like two parts of the same soul. "My sister found her when she was just a foal, abandoned and half dead from hunger. She nursed her back to health and they grew up together." Ayana climbed over the fence with a grace that reminded Jake of the way Dakota moved when she was doing her strange dance. The horse immediately pressed her head against Ayana's chest, making soft sounds that Jake had never heard before. It was like watching a reunion between family members who had been separated for years. "I have been watching you for weeks," Ayana continued, running her hands through Dakota's mane with practiced familiarity. "When I heard that Big Tom Harrigan had lost her in a poker game, I thought it might be another cruel white man who would try to break her spirit completely. But you were different." Jake felt a flush of embarrassment. "I tried to break her at first, used all the traditional methods." "I know, I saw." Ayana's smile was sad but not unkind. "But you stopped when you realized those methods were hurting her. You started listening instead of just commanding. That told me something important about who you are." She walked around Dakota with the easy confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Every few steps, she would touch a different part of the horse's body, checking for injuries or signs of mistreatment. Dakota stood perfectly still, her eyes half closed in contentment. "Tell me about Kimimela," Jake said, sensing that Ayana needed to share this story as much as he needed to hear it. Ayana was quiet for so long that Jake wondered if she had heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She was my younger sister by 3 years, the most beautiful girl in our tribe, with a laugh that could make flowers bloom and a heart so big it had room for every wounded creature she ever found." Ayana paused, her hand resting on the beadwork in Dakota's mane. "She was also the most gifted horse dancer our people had ever seen." "Horse dancer?" Jake asked. "It is an ancient art among our people," Ayana explained. "Not riding in the way white men understand it, but becoming one with the horse, moving together as a single spirit. It takes years to learn, and most never master it. But Kimimela and Dakota were naturals. They could dance together like water flows downhill, effortless and perfect." Jake remembered the strange, graceful movements he had seen Dakota perform when Ayana first appeared on the ridge. "I saw her do something like that. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "She was trying to show you what she needed," Ayana said, "what she missed most. The dance was how she and Kimimela expressed their joy, their connection to each other and to the earth. When you saw that dance, you were seeing my sister's spirit still living in Dakota's heart." Ayana began pointing to different sections of the beadwork woven into Dakota's mane, explaining what each pattern meant. "This section here with the blue and white beads represents the day Kimimela first learned to dance with Dakota. She was so excited that she ran all the way home to tell our mother, her feet barely touching the ground." Ayana's voice grew warmer as she shared the memory. This red pattern here is for the first time they performed the sacred dance in front of the whole tribe. Kimimela was nervous, but Dakota was so steady and sure that she gave my sister confidence. Each bead seemed to hold a story, a moment of joy or accomplishment or love between the girl and her horse. Jake realized he was looking at more than just decorations. This was a history, a life story told in colored glass and careful craftsmanship. She spent the whole winter of her 16th year making this beadwork, Ayana continued. Every evening after her other duties were done, she would sit by the fire and work on it, planning each pattern, each color combination. She wanted Dakota to be the most beautiful horse anyone had ever seen. What happened to her? Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. Ayana's face crumpled with pain. Last winter was the hardest our people had faced in many years. The government had moved us to land that was not suitable for farming or hunting, and we were struggling just to survive. Then the fever came. She walked to the other side of Dakota and pointed to a small section of black beads near the horses. "Here, I added these after Kimimela died," she said. "Our tradition says that black beads carry prayers for the dead, help their spirits find peace in the next world. But I think Dakota's spirit was too tied to this world, too connected to my sister's memory to find peace." Jake began to understand the depth of the horse's grief. She hadn't just lost an owner or even a friend. She had lost the other half of her soul. "How did Dakota end up with Harrigan?" Jake asked. Ayana's expression darkened. 3 days after we buried Kimimela, Dakota disappeared. We searched everywhere, thinking maybe she had gone to die of grief, like some animals do when they lose their mate. But she was too smart, too strong for that. We found out later that horse thieves had been watching our reservation, waiting for opportunities to steal our best animals. They captured her? It took them 2 weeks and 6 men, according to the stories I heard later. She fought them every step of the way, injuring 3 of them badly enough that they needed a doctor. But eventually, hunger and exhaustion wore her down. Ayana's voice was filled with admiration mixed with sadness. They sold her to Harrigan, telling him she was wild and unbroken. They didn't mention that she was grieving. Jake felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it all. "Why didn't you try to get her back? With what?" Ayana asked bitterly. "We had no money, no legal standing in white man's courts. Harrigan owned her legally as far as your law was concerned. All I could do was watch from a distance and hope that whoever ended up with her would treat her with kindness." She pulled the small leather pouch from around Dakota's neck, handling it with the reverence someone might show a religious artifact. "This contains a lock of Camilla's hair and her favorite turquoise stone," Ayana explained. "I made it the night before the funeral so that a part of my sister would always travel with Dakota. I think it has made the grieving harder for her. She cannot let go because she carries Kimimela with her everywhere she goes." Jake watched as Ayana opened the pouch carefully, showing him the contents. The hair was silky and black, braided with tiny beads that caught the sunlight. The turquoise stone was small but perfectly formed, worn smooth by years of handling. "Kimimela always carried this stone with her," Ayana said. "Our grandmother gave it to her when she was 7 years old, told her it would bring her courage and protect her from harm. She was holding it when she died." The weight of the story settled over Jake like a heavy blanket. He began to see Dakota's behavior in a completely new light. Her aggression hadn't been meanness or wildness. It had been desperate protection of the only thing she had left of the person she loved most. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked. "I want to know if you are worthy of her trust," Ayana replied without hesitation. "Dakota has been betrayed by men who saw her only as property to be broken and used. She needs someone who understands that she is sacred, that her grief is holy, that her love for my sister must be honored. And if I am worthy, then I will teach you the true way to work with her," Ayana said. "Not the white man's way of domination and control, but our way of partnership and respect. I will teach you the dances that my sister taught her, the songs that bring her peace, the rituals that honor the bond between human and horse." Jake felt the magnitude of what she was offering. This wasn't just about learning to ride a difficult horse. This was about being inducted into something ancient and sacred, something that most white men would never even know existed. "And if I'm not worthy?" he asked. Ayana's eyes hardened. "Then I will take her away from here, even if it means stealing her back. I will not let another man destroy what is left of my sister's spirit." Jake looked at Dakota, who was watching their conversation, with intelligent eyes, as if she understood every word being spoken. He thought about the weeks of struggle, the moments of breakthrough, the growing sense that this horse was teaching him something important about patience, respect, and love. "I'm willing to learn," he said finally. "But I need you to understand something too. I'm not doing this just to have a rideable horse. I'm doing this because I think Dakota and I need each other. I'm grieving too, in my own way. Maybe we can help each other heal." Ayana studied his face for a long moment, searching for something only she would recognize. Finally, she nodded. Dawn came cold and gray, with frost covering the grass around Jake's ranch. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts about what Ayana would teach him, and whether he was truly ready for something so different from everything he knew. About horses. Ayana arrived just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, leading her own horse, a beautiful black Mari with silver decorations braided into her mane. She dismounted gracefully and walked to the fence where Dakota was waiting, as if the horse had known she was coming. "The first thing you must understand," Ayana said without any greeting, "is that you know nothing about horses." Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I've been working with horses my whole life." "You have been working with horses the white man's way," Ayana corrected gently but firmly. "You have been taught to see them as tools, as things to be controlled and used. We see them as partners, as beings with their own thoughts and feelings and desires." She moved to stand beside Dakota, placing her hand on the horse's neck with a familiarity that spoke of years of practice. "Watch how I breathe," she instructed. "Watch how Dakota breathes." "Do you see the difference?" Jake watched carefully. Ayana's breathing was slow and deep, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Dakota's breathing seemed to match hers perfectly, as if they were connected by some invisible thread. "Horses are creatures of energy," Ayana explained. "They feel everything you feel, sometimes before you even know you're feeling it. If you are tense, they become tense. If you are angry, they become defensive. If you are peaceful, they can become peaceful too." She spent the first hour just teaching Jake how to breathe properly, how to calm his mind and body so that Dakota would feel safe around him. It was harder than it sounded. Every time Jake thought he was relaxed, Ayana would point out tension in his shoulders or anxiety in his movements that he hadn't even noticed. "This is why Dakota fought you so hard in the beginning," Ayana said. "You came to her carrying fear and frustration and desperation. She could feel all of that, and it made her want to protect herself." Slowly, as Jake learned to control his breathing and his energy, Dakota began to respond differently. Instead of watching him warily, she started to approach him with curiosity. By the end of the first lesson, she was allowing him to touch her neck and shoulders without flinching. "Good," Ayana said with approval. "Tomorrow we will begin teaching you the language of movement." The next morning brought a light snow, turning Jake's ranch into a winter wonderland. Ayana arrived even earlier this time, carrying a leather bag filled with things Jake had never seen before. She pulled out what looked like bells made of carved bone and small metal discs that chimed softly when moved. "These are dancing bells," she explained, attaching them to Dakota's legs and neck. "They help the horse feel the rhythm, help her remember the joy of movement instead of just the work of it." Then came Jake's first real lesson in horse dancing, and it was nothing like what he had expected. Instead of climbing onto Dakota's back, Ayana had him stand beside her and simply walk. But it wasn't ordinary walking. Every step had to be perfectly timed with the horse's movement, every breath coordinated with hers. "Feel her rhythm," Ayana instructed, demonstrating the proper technique. "Don't try to make her follow you. Instead, you follow her until you both become one rhythm, one heartbeat." It took Jake 3 hours just to master walking in sync with Dakota. His legs ached and his feet were numb from the cold, but something magical was happening. The more he focused on matching Dakota's natural rhythm, the more connected he felt to her. It was like learning a new language, one spoken not with words but with movement and breath and shared intention. By the end of the first week, Jake could walk, turn, and stop in perfect harmony with Dakota. The horse seemed to enjoy these sessions. As much as he did, her ears perked forward with interest, her steps becoming lighter and more graceful as the days went by. But the real breakthrough came when Ayana began teaching him the sacred dances that Kimimela had created. Each dance tells a story, Ayana explained, her voice taking on the reverent tone she used whenever she talked about her sister. This first one is called The Dance of Meeting. It tells the story of how Kimimela first found Dakota as a foal. Ayana demonstrated the movements, and Jake watched in awe as she and Dakota performed something that looked like pure poetry in motion. The horse would rear up gently, her front hooves barely leaving the ground, while Ayana spun slowly around her. Then Dakota would lower her head, and they would walk in a tight circle together, the bells on her legs creating a soft, rhythmic music. The rearing represents the first moment they saw each other, Ayana explained. The spinning is the recognition. The moment when two souls know they belong together. The walking in circles is the beginning of their journey as partners. Jake's first attempts were clumsy and awkward. He couldn't get the timing right, couldn't find the grace that made Ayana's movements look so effortless. But Dakota was patient with him, seeming to understand that he was trying to honor her memories of as autumn turned to winter. Jake's skills improved dramatically. He learned the Dance of Seasons, which told the story of a year in the life of the tribe. He learned the Dance of Storms, which represented the challenges that Kimimela and Dakota had faced together. And slowly, carefully, Ayana began teaching him the most sacred dance of all. This is the Dance of Spirits, she said solemnly. Kimimela created it during her final illness, when she knew she was going to die. It is her way of saying goodbye. To Dakota, her promise that their connection would continue even after death. Learning this dance was the hardest thing Jake had ever done. Not because the movements were particularly difficult, but because of the emotion it carried. Every step, every turn, every moment of stillness was filled with love and loss and hope. When he performed it with Dakota, he could feel Kimimola's presence so strongly that it sometimes brought tears to his eyes, but their growing partnership faced challenges beyond the complexity of the dances. Big Tom Harrigan had been hearing stories about Jake's circus tricks with the paint horse, and he wasn't happy about it. 3 times that winter, Harrigan showed up at Jake's ranch with different men, claiming that the poker game had been invalid and demanding the horse back. That animal was worthless when you won her, Harrigan argued during his latest visit, his face red with anger. Now you've got her doing tricks like some kind of carnival act. That increases her value considerably, which means you owe me money. Jake stood his ground, but he could see the greed in Harrigan's eyes. The man was looking for any excuse to reclaim Dakota, and Jake knew that legal documents and property rights wouldn't protect them if Harrigan decided to take her by force. Meanwhile, Ayana was facing her own troubles. Government agents had been visiting the reservation, pressuring the Kiowa to sell more of their land to white settlers. The tribal council was divided, with some members wanting to resist and others believing they had no choice but to cooperate. They are offering money for our land, Ayana told Jake during one of their training sessions. Money we desperately need for food and medicine and warm clothes. But if we sell, we will have to move even farther away, to land that is even worse for farming and hunting. Jake could see the strain these pressures were putting on her. She was torn between her duty to her people and her desire to honor her sister's memory by continuing Dakota's training. Some members of the tribe disapproved of her spending so much time with a white man, while others understood the importance of what she was doing. Through it all, Jake found himself falling in love. Not just with the art of horse dancing, though that had become a passion that consumed his thoughts and dreams. He was falling in love with Ayana herself. Her quiet strength, her deep connection to the natural world, her fierce loyalty to her Sister's memory and her patient, generous spirit all combined to create someone unlike anyone he had ever known, but he also knew how impossible such a love would be. In 1887 Texas, relationships between white men and Native women were not just frowned upon, they were dangerous. Men had been killed for less, and women had been cast out from both their own communities and white society. One snowy evening in December, as they finished practicing the dance of spirits, Jake finally found the courage to speak about his feelings. "Ayana," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I need you to know something. These past months, learning from you, working with Dakota, understanding the sacred nature of what your sister created, it's changed me completely." Ayana looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "I know," she said simply. "I love you," Jake said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know it's complicated, I know it's dangerous, I know it probably can't lead to anything good. But I needed you to know." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on Dakota's neck. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I have seen into your heart through the way you treat Dakota," she said. "I have seen your respect for my sister's memory, your willingness to learn our ways, your patience with something you did not understand. Love is not just a feeling, Jake Morrison. Love is a choice you make every day, a commitment to honor and protect what matters most." The torches flickered in the snowy darkness as Harrigan and 6 armed men surrounded Jake's ranch. Their horses snorted and stamped in the cold, creating clouds of steam that made the whole scene look like something from a nightmare. Jake could see the sheriff among them, his badge glinting in the firelight, and his heart sank. This wasn't just a dispute between neighbors anymore. "Morrison!" Harrigan shouted again. "I've got legal papers here that say you're in possession of stolen property. That horse belongs to me, and I'm taking her back tonight." Jake stepped out of the barn, keeping his hands visible but ready. Ayana stayed hidden in the shadows with Dakota, but he could feel her presence like a steady warmth at his back. "We settled this months ago, Harrigan," Jake called back. "Fair and square in a poker game, you've got no claim on her." "That's where you're wrong, son." Sheriff Clayton dismounted and walked forward, holding a rolled paper. "Got a complaint here from Mr. Harrigan saying you've been harboring a horse. That was stolen from the Kiowa reservation. Says you've been working with an Indian woman who's probably the thief herself." Jake's blood ran cold. Harrigan had twisted the truth into something that could get both him and Ayana arrested, or worse. In 1887 Texas, accusations like these could lead to a hanging tree. "That's a lie," Jake said firmly. "The woman you're talking about is the horse's rightful family. If anyone stole this horse, it was the men who sold her to Harrigan in the first place." Harrigan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You see, Sheriff? He admits he's been conspiring with reservation Indians. Probably planning to steal more horses and sell them up north." The sheriff looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, but Jake could see he was going to follow Harrigan's lead. Too much money and influence was at stake for him to do otherwise. "Step aside, Morrison," Clayton said wearily. "Let us take the horse and we'll pretend we never saw any Indian woman. Make this easy on yourself." "No." The word came out stronger than Jake had expected. He planted his feet firmly and crossed his arms. "I won't let you take her. She's not stolen property, and she's not just a horse to be passed around between men who see her as nothing but money." "Then you're under arrest for harboring stolen goods and conspiracy," Clayton said, reaching for his handcuffs. That's when Ayana stepped out of the shadows. She moved with the same grace Jake had seen her display during their dancing lessons. But now there was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. Dakota walked beside her, the bells on her legs chiming softly in the cold night air. The effect was stunning, even in the harsh torchlight. Here was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of legend, accompanied by a horse so beautiful it took your breath away. "I am Ayala of the Kiowa people," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. "This horse belonged to my sister, who died last winter. She was stolen from our reservation and sold to this man illegally." She pointed directly at Harrigan. If anyone here is a thief, it is him. Harrigan's face turned purple with rage. See. Sheriff, there's your Indian thief. Arrest her. But something had changed in Sheriff Clayton's expression. Jake realized the man was staring at Ayanna and Dakota with something approaching awe. The horse's beauty was undeniable, but there was something more. Even these rough men could sense that they were in the presence of something sacred. That's a beautiful animal, Clayton said slowly. Real beautiful, never seen beadwork like that before. My sister spent a year making those decorations, Ayanna said proudly. Every bead tells a story of their life together. Every pattern has meaning. This is not just a horse, she is a living memory. Harrigan sensed he was losing control of the situation. Enough talking, he snarled. Sheriff, do your job, or I'll find someone who will. Clayton's hand moved to his gun, but he still looked reluctant. The other men shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of arresting a woman and stealing her horse. Legal papers or not, that's when Jake made the decision that would change everything. You want proof that this horse isn't just property? Jake asked loudly. You want to see why Harrigan never could break her, why she's worth more than all the money in your pocket. Before anyone could answer, Jake walked to Ayanna's side and took her hand. The gesture was small, but in that time and place, it spoke volumes about what he was willing to risk. Show them, he said quietly. Show them the dance of spirits. Ayanna looked into his eyes, searching for doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she nodded slowly. What happened next was like nothing any of those men had ever seen before. As Ayanna began to sing in her native language, her voice rising and falling like wind through trees, Dakota began to move. But this wasn't the angry, violent movement the men had heard about. This was pure grace made visible. The horse rose up on her hind legs, not in aggression but in celebration, her front hooves barely touching the air as she seemed to float. Ayanna spun slowly around her, their movements perfectly synchronized, while the bells created a haunting music that mixed with her song. Jake joined them, his months of training evident in every step. He moved with them as an equal partner, not trying to control or dominate, but adding his own part to their ancient dance. Together, the three of them told the story of Kamoa's life, her love for Dakota, her acceptance of death, and her promise that love would continue beyond the grave. The men watching stood transfixed. Even Harrigan had stopped shouting, his mouth hanging open as he witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about horses and Indians and the natural order of things. When the dance ended, the silence stretched on for long moments. Ayanna's song faded away, but its echo seemed to hang in the cold air. Dakota stood perfectly still, her breathing calm and even, while Jake and Ayanna flanked her like guardians. Sheriff Clayton was the first to speak, his voice hushed with something approaching reverence. I've never seen anything like that in my whole life, he admitted. That horse wasn't performing tricks. She was she was mourning, wasn't she? Mourning that girl who died, yes, Ayanna said simply, and celebrating her memory, and showing you that some things are too sacred to be owned. Harrigan finally found his voice, but the bluster was gone out of it. It's still just a horse, he said weakly, still my property according to the law. Your law, one of Harrigan's own men said unexpectedly. It was Pete Williams, the neighboring rancher who had watched Jake's early struggles with Dakota. But maybe there are laws that matter more than what's written on paper. The other men began to nod and murmur agreement. Jake realized that the dance had accomplished something he never could have done with words or arguments. It had shown these hard, practical men that Dakota was more than property, that her bond with Kimimela and now with Ayanna represented something holy that shouldn't be broken for mere money. Sheriff Clayton handed the legal papers back to Harrigan, without looking at them. I can't arrest people for honoring their dead, he said firmly. And I won't be part of breaking up something like what we just saw. Harrigan looked around at his men, realizing he had lost their support completely. His face was a mask of fury, but there was nothing he could do. 6 men might force compliance, but 6 men who had lost their will to fight were useless. This isn't over, Morrison, Harrigan threatened as he climbed back onto his horse. You think you can make a fool of me in front of the whole county? You'll regret this, but his words carried no real threat anymore. As the men rode away, their torches disappearing into the snowy darkness, Jake felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. What happens now? He asked Ayana. She was quiet for a moment, stroking Dakota's neck while she considered their options. Now we make the choice that we have been avoiding, she said finally. We can try to stay here and pretend that nothing has changed, or we can accept that everything has changed and act accordingly. Jake knew what she meant. Their public display of partnership, his obvious love for her, and her presence on his land had made it impossible for them to continue as they had been. Word would spread throughout the county about what had happened tonight. Some people would be sympathetic, but others would be hostile. Harrigan would look for other ways to cause trouble, and the government agents would use Ayana's relationship with a white man as an excuse to put more pressure on her people. I've been thinking about California, Jake said. My uncle wrote me last year about opportunities out there. Land that's still cheap, people who are more interested in what you can do than where you came from. You would leave all this? Ayana gestured toward his ranch, his home, everything he had built. For you, for us, in a heartbeat. Jake took her hands in his. This place is just land and buildings. What we have, what we've built together, that's something I can take anywhere. Ayana smiled, and Jake saw tears glistening in her eyes. My people are being forced to sell our land anyway. She said, the government agents will win eventually. Maybe it is time for me to choose my own path instead of waiting for others to choose it for me. They spent the rest of that long, cold night making plans. Jake would sell the ranch and use the money to help Ayana's people fight the land seizure for as long as possible. Whatever was left would fund their journey west, to a place where they could start fresh without the weight of other